So yeah, I'm really kind of following up from Kathy's presentation on how LabKey helps support this migration. I think a little bit different than how Ankit actually was describing their process of doing the migration to Sample Manager. LabKey was a lot more involved with this, I think, for a variety of reasons, but one of those is we've been involved in other Freezer Pro migrations before this, and so we're familiar with the system. I was a user of Freezer Pro for about 6 years prior to that as well, and so we really had kind of the right expertise needed to be able to support this. And they were working on such a tight timeline. We also wanted to make sure that we could help them be as successful as possible. So similar to what Kathy described and kind of what Ankit had described earlier, actually, we really went through sort of these phases or series of processes to perform this migration and to prepare for it. So the biggest starting point was to gain alignment. This was something that was happening to the labs and the users of a sample management system rather than folks sort of electing into it. And so we really wanted to make sure that we had that alignment and making sure that people knew what Sample Manager was sort of prior to the migration. We also took the time to make sure that we highlighted the differences between sort of that legacy system and Freezer Pro and Sample Manager, and that was something based on sort of our prior experience with Freezer Pro migrations, we were able to speak to quite well. That allowed for users to understand what they'd be gaining with using the sample management system, and how there could be more sort of metadata associated or different levels of the sample hierarchy that Freezer Pro doesn't currently support. We then sort of went in, and to Kathy's point about assessing what labs were actually using Freezer Pro at the time and what those processes were. She mentioned that there was a number of labs that actually weren't actively using it, and for some of the labs that were, not all of their freezers were actually needed to be migrated, and that was really due to some of the freezer-centric nature of that system, that essentially folks had kept samples in a freezer that is meant for disposal, which as some of us know here for Sample Manager, that's already sort of built into the system. So we're able to kind of assess what freezers would be moving over and which wouldn't. And LabKey then individually met with these labs to make sure that we talked to them about what the samples were, what that ultimate sample structure could be within Sample Manager, and having those conversations individually really helped kind of gain the trust, I think, of the labs, as well as give us an understanding of how far we could go and sort of cleaning the data or making improvements during that migration process. So that next step was really about preparation, where Kathy mentioned we tried exporting Freezer Pro data directly from the Freezer Pro UI. That was successful only part of the time, as the storage got really big. The Freezer Pro UI would time out, or our VPN connection would time out, and so we had a lot of struggles trying to export the data directly from the UI, which is what we've actually done in previous migrations from Freezer Pro. But because there was so much data there, we really needed direct access to that Freezer Pro database backup, which Nick and Kathy helped us obtain, which ended up being much easier. We then took the fields that were in Freezer Pro and mapped them to what they should be in Sample Manager. The other thing that Kathy mentioned and Ankit mentioned, making sure that data is getting cleaned. There was a lot of fields that maybe were indicated that they should be of a certain data type, like a date, but not all of the values were date-based. And so we worked with the labs to sort of clean that data up. And then we configured Sample Manager with that, with the lab input of fields maybe that they wanted to include that they hadn't included in the legacy system, or fields that had been included in the legacy system that were no longer serving them. So we chose kind of different approaches and how we chose to migrate that data, combining it into sort of a general comments column just for that record, or completely removing it because it really wasn't understood or useful anymore. And then we did that migration. So similar to what Ankit had mentioned, we actually ran a test migration. So in sort of his example, he called it a proof of concept. This was really a way for us to see kind of how long that process would take. And so essentially how much downtime we would anticipate between the two systems, because we were planning for that hard cutover between Freezer Pro and Sample Manager. We then allowed the labs to have access to that as well. And so we could gather feedback in terms of the field mapping or additional fields, or even ordering on some of the fields and in Sample Manager. And then we really prepared them for the go live. So we let them know about that process, as Kathy mentioned. And then we performed the migration. After the migration, we really did sort of iterate and continue to reach out to the labs or meet with labs to refine some of those configurations and workflows. To Lance's question that he brought up around kind of what that looked like, certainly we tried to make ourselves as available as possible for anybody who did have questions. And it was kind of a mixed bag in terms of what labs wanted to take advantage of that versus not, which is not uncommon for us to experience. So just really quickly kind of talking about the lessons learned here. I think having Freezer Pro access to the database was certainly useful to perform the migration. The UI, though, did give us a very quick way to validate and confirm some of the migration scripts that we did. So essentially pulling up the same box in both systems and ensuring that they matched. Consolidating the sample types. So because the Freezer Pro administration had been so broad, there were a lot of very similar sample types. So maybe 3 or 4 different plasma sample types that labs maybe didn't intend to use all 4 of them, but sort of accidentally over the years had chosen to do. So we really made sure to consolidate that. So the data was cleaner and much more understood for labs going into Sample Manager. Making sure that we had the sample types and the storage designed up front for that final migration really allowed the imports to go much faster and that process to be expedited. And so we were able to do that all within kind of one business day for that next Monday for the labs to log in and start using Sample Manager. The other thing that these are kind of the nitty gritties, but I was really pleased. We decided to generate the sample IDs within our custom scripts rather than letting Sample Manager generate those IDs upon import. And that actually allowed us to iterate much more easily on adjustment of fields or updates because we had that sample ID rather than having to go into Sample Manager, extract that sample ID, and then perform the update. Trimming white spaces, I would say, is another thing just in general from migrations of other legacy systems that we've run into a lot. A lot of legacy systems do not trim white space, and Sample Manager and LabKey does a very good job of that. And so when we're sort of considering migration over, we wanted to make sure to have those white spaces trimmed so we could appropriately map the data. So when we were creating lineage, for example, there wasn't a trailing white space in the Freezer Pro data, but then no trailing white space in the Sample Manager data. So making sure we did that as part of the script was super important. And then I love to see that Ankit brought this up as well. We use those grouped permissions to really allow each lab to have their own sort of access and control over their system. In terms of sort of the process and communication, We had the pre and post migration training, which I thought was very, very helpful in sort of supporting these labs that, again, this was something sort of happening to them rather than opting in at this stage. And making sure that we had those lab check-ins after that test migration of how does this look? Is this something, is there anything we can change for you sort of before we perform that final migration was great. And then having that centralized customer contact like Kathy to help drive those decisions made sure that we were able to do this within the timeline. Because we were working under such a tight timeline, being able to get those decisions made quickly and efficiently was really, really vital to the success of this project.